Hello, can you hear me? You know the way better than me. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Hi everyone. Hi. Just to get your attention. Hi. Thanks for coming to Wow Conversations. I think we'll start now. Don't think we'll wait for any more. Thanks so much for sitting on the floor. This is a very casual conversation, so please feel free to ask questions at any point in time.
People move forward, so in case people come later.
There are more people
There are more people
coming, so if we could kind of like shuffle a little bit. Yeah, and then they could just sit around and find space. Yeah. Thanks so much. Yeah. Thank you. Okay, so what is Wow Conversation? So I think there are a lot of new faces here, so I'll just introduce Wow Conversation. So it is a casual conversation over food and drink, so please feel free to eat and drink, of course. And we usually invite a guest speaker to come and discuss about their topic of specialty. So today we will be talking about corals, and we hope to use this platform to raise awareness, to educate people about the different issues that we face. So it's casual, so please feel free to ask any questions at any point in time, the people online as well. So we want to thank our venue partner. So this place actually belongs to Stranger Conversations. So do follow them on IG at Stranger Convos. So they are a community space and a community that does a lot of sharing and conversations as well. So the person's not here anymore, so I'll just introduce the space for him. I would also like to thank our videographer and photographer. So we have Sun and we have Kelly who's there. So thanks guys for manning the booth, and Wei Yang who's dialing in remotely. Yeah. So if you would not like to be in any of the photos, you kind of have to let me know so that we'll try to not take photos of you, but otherwise you will be in the picture. For those who just came, you can just find a seat anywhere on the floor. Okay, and while this conversation is free to attend, we do try to raise funds for conservation, and today we will be raising funds for our Singapore reefs. Sam is here, yay! So what is our Singapore reefs? Can our Singapore reefs please give an introduction? Come here. Oh, it's actually, yes, people are live streaming in from everywhere.
Oh dear. You got audience from Australia, this one I can confirm.
Yeah.
Hi, so thank you everyone for coming. I think a lot of nice new faces, so thank you Danwei also for doing this. Okay, so our Singapore is like a platform where we want to bring people together who really love the ocean and give opportunities to really, so mainly we do dive cleanup. So we bring divers to the sea, we pick up trash underwater, and then we count them. And then we also do like coral restoration, training people to do planting, monitoring, 2 different actions. You can do a little bit for the ocean. Okay, so thank you so much. You can find us at our Singapore Reef on Instagram. Okay.
Yay, thank you. So I will pass this form around. It's like a PayNow QR code. And of course, if you'd like to contribute towards Wow Conversations, please do as well. So I'll just pass this around. I'll go for it. Okay. So usually I'll start with an introduction of our speaker. I think he doesn't need too much introduction. Most of you seem to know him here. So anyway, today we have Danwei, the Deputy Head and Associate Professor of the Chian Natural History Museum. And his research expertise is on coral reef ecosystems. So to get started, I like to start off with like a warm-up to see how much we know, okay? So if I'm wrong, you must correct me. Okay. So, these are questions. No, there is of course a correct answer. But there are designated marine parks in Singapore. Who can name me which are the marine parks? Anybody?
St. John Island, Sister Island.
Sisters Island, yes. And then? Lazarus. And? One more. No. One more. Kusu. So actually, I think currently the only one is Sisters Island. Kusu and Lazarus are going to be in. later on. Yeah, but they've just announced it. Yeah, so now we know. What is the size of the Sisters Island Marine Park? Okay, I'll give you 3 options. 4 hectares, 40 hectares, 400 hectares. So 4, 40, or 400? 40. Oh, okay, 4. Raise your hands. 1, 2. 40. Wow, okay, about 30%. Okay, 400. Wow, nobody. Then what about the rest? Yeah, so it's 40. So 40 is about like 80 football fields, I think. Yeah, so it's quite big, but I think can be bigger. Okay, how many species of hard corals can be found in Singapore? I got this from a newspaper article, so those who read newspaper will know. Okay, so A, 95, B, 250, C, 600. How many species of hard corals can be found in Singapore? A, 95, raise your hands. What's so low? B, 250, raise your hands. Wow, not bad. C, 600. Wow, 1, 2, 3. Okay, 4. All right, so B is the correct answer. Singapore has 250 species of hard corals out of over 800 species found worldwide, correct?
I think so.
Yeah.
Depends,
From an article from Street Times. Okay, so seems right. So okay, let's get started. I think I will put up the. Okay, yeah. So yeah, we can get started with questions. Maybe we can start by, I'll start off with a generic question about what are corals, because I think for the benefit of doubt, not everyone knows what corals are. So yeah, so what are corals?
Okay, maybe I ask the question back to you. So corals have been thought to be a variety of things, including animal. Some people think they are plants. Some people think they are rocks. What do you think? Animal. Okay. So I think animal is one of the right answers. Actually, corals can be plants if you consider them as they make food for themselves, in a sense that they have a symbiont. So they pair with they partner with an algae, which is kind of a plant, and the algae live in the cell of the coral, and they make food from sunlight. And so it is, in a sense, functionally a plant. But also geologically it can be a rock, because actually they produce these limestone structures, and these limestone structures fossilize, they become rock, and so you wouldn't be wrong if you chose rock or plant. But of course, fundamentally corals are animals, in that they the main living part of it is an animal, and you can think of it like a jellyfish. You turn the jellyfish upside down, that becomes like an anemone, and then you put the anemone down on the ground, and you make multiple copies of that, clone each other, and that becomes a colonial anemone. And if you imagine those anemones, they make calcium carbonate or limestone houses around themselves, then that becomes a coral. So basically a coral is basically an inverted jellyfish that makes limestone houses for themselves. That's how I would describe them. Yeah, so animals, yes.
Wow.
And then that's the first question, right? Corals.
Yeah.
What is a coral reef? So what is a coral reef to you? Have you, anyone, most of you, some of you have seen a coral reef? Yes,
Yeah.
sir.
It would be a collection of corals that are both alive and dead. The dead ones are kind of the base, which is, I think, where we tend to think of coral as rock. That's what we're looking at.
Yeah.
And then the upper level is being live, but it's a bunch of these different colonies. So you might have, and you might have an incredible variety. You might have a fan. You might have a more, you're upside down anemone analogy.
Yeah.
So you might have a gorgon fawn. You might have softs. You might have hards, etc.
Right. No, that's a good answer. Are you a geologist by any chance? Or?
I'm an avid scuba diver.
Aha, nice.
Dive photographer.
Excellent. Yeah. So when you go to a reef and let's say you go diving, I think you'll be enthralled by the colors and the diversity, right? But that part that you see is really a thin veneer over the entire structure. So what you're seeing would be the coral, the living coral, the upside down jellyfish making its houses. So under that is basically all rock, right? And that rock is formed by the coral, that living part, and it builds upwards, right? Builds upwards, and over time, if it's basically trying to catch up with sea level in a sense. So as it grows upwards, if sea level rises, it will keep growing upwards, right? And so as it goes upward, it will just shift itself to be the top level, and so that's the thin living layer that you see. Everything below is dead. So when you ask what is a coral reef scientist, mainly it's a geologist, because most of the reef is dead. It's a geological structure. Yeah. But a reef fundamentally is basically a nautical term. So if you take boats out, people talk about reef as if they are very dangerous, and in fact they are very dangerous. So people have run aground on reefs and so on. So the reef, if it's formed by sand, you can call it a sandbar and so on. Those are formed geologically, right? They are formed by deposition. But if they are formed by living animals, for instance, like sponges, you can call them sponge reefs. There are sponges that build reefs. There are also oysters that build reefs, not in Singapore and tropics, but in the temperate areas. But in tropical areas, then typically you find corals, these upside down jellyfish, build those structures and they form the reef structure. And so that's how we derive or come to this coral reef. Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
You mentioned growing up,
Yeah.
kind of vertical growth. What about horizontal propagation?
Yeah, good
Yeah.
question.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Do you guys want to like sit down first? Yeah. Yeah, just find a place to. Oh, okay.
Oh, you need to repeat the question.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, we'll just let them settle down. Yeah, just look for a place to. Yeah. So I think the question was, can they propagate like horizontally?
Horizontal propagation.
Yeah.
You
And
talked about the growing up, but
yeah.
Yeah, so the reef grows wherever there's space, right? And wherever there's light, because we mentioned that corals take food based on the light energy that's incident on it. So if it's below sea level, then you will try to get as close to the light as possible, which is upwards, right? But sometimes there's space at the side and there's still light on the side, and so they'll grow sidewards. Yeah, so that's the reef growing. But when we talk about the reef growing, it's based on individual corals that are growing, right? So you don't actually see the reef growing, you just see the corals themselves get larger. And over time, those corals, they will just keep growing upwards. And overall, that reef is growing, right? But and you see that in geological time. So that means thousands of years or 10,000s of years. But over years and perhaps decades, you see corals growing. Yeah, and then that's basically upwards generally, sometimes sideways. As long as there's space, you will colonize. And of course, it's not just corals that are living on reefs. There's other things like algae, right? Seaweed. There is other invertebrates, other animals that grow there. So they all compete for space, right? So if you go to the reef, you notice not just the colors, but also that it's packed full of things, right? It's just colors over colors. There's coral over coral over coral over coral, and then there's just stacked full of these structures. So space is a luxury in a reef environment. Whenever you have a reef that is dominated by corals, it means that the corals have the upper hand against everything else, including seaweed. But sometimes when corals are stressed, they may die, and if they die, they let go of that space. So other things that will compete for that space, like seaweed, they come over and take over that space, right? So that's quite common in a lot of degraded reefs around the world, where you have, for instance, it could be bleaching, it could be like warming induced bleaching, or it could be other stresses that the corals face. If the corals leave the space, it will be taken over. It can be taken over by other things that can outcompete it much better. So for instance, if you have if there's a lot of light, then obviously algae, seaweed are very good at growing fast, so they will take over the space. So if they do that, then they will deprive corals of the space, and then eventually it converts itself to what we call a seaweed-dominated environment, which it will be degraded. Yeah.
So does it always mean that in an environment where you see a lot of seaweed, it would have meant that corals were there previously, and then they had just slowly taken over?
Yeah, so it depends. So you have to, in a way, so change is actually a very, it's a perennial thing that happens on the reef, right? Change in the sense that you can have corals dying, you can have seaweed growing, and so on. Now, there's something in environmental speak we call baseline. So baseline is what you set as what the basic or the basal level of that environment. So if you take reefs to a baseline where there's a lot of coral, then of course eventually later on if there's a lot of seaweed, then that baseline has changed, and so you have basically, we call that degradation because the coral has let go of its space and then the seaweed is taken over. But there are actually areas where seaweed is dominant, right? So areas like I don't know, have you been to Korea? Have you been to Jeju Island? Right, some of you have been to Jeju. Have you dived? Anyone dived in Jeju Island before?
No, I went to Seoul.
Mar- yeah, dominated. Exactly. So subtropical temperate areas. These are actually seaweed-dominated areas. Now, there is an environmental crisis right now I would think it's an environmental crisis right now in Jeju, for instance, because there are reefs growing there and there are corals growing there. So you would think, what's wrong with corals growing there, right? It's because the baseline there is that there were lots of seaweed and a lot of livelihoods rely on those seaweed and also the herbivores that feed on the seaweed. So if you convert that to become coral dominated, then people lose their livelihoods, right? And that baseline has changed. So it kind of depends on where you are and in time what was the environment like, and so when you say a degraded reef, it really depends on where was it before. Right, so in terms of in Singapore, I think you would consider that it has changed over the last 5 decades, and primarily because of coastal development and all that has made the waters a bit more turbid, and so now the reef has changed to become more adapted to the kind of environment. So it has changed, it has shifted. A bit more algae because the seaweed because the seaweed grows a bit faster than the coral, so you see a bit more seaweed.
I see. Wow, very interesting. So, yeah.
I wanted to ask a question going back to your analogy of the upside down jellyfish. So is it reasonable to think of or analogize that corals form their structures, their coralline structures, with the algae that come in and inhabit them?
The algae
So
lives
they're
inside.
essentially acting as farmers. The corals are farming.
Right.
Because it sounds like it's a symbiotic relationship there.
So I think the question is really if the algae is whether is it kind of like using it to form new corals, right? The algae is taking,
Or
yeah.
the farming, or or is kind of, is it the coral bringing the algae in and using it to their benefit, which would be one way of looking at it, which is the farming kind of, or is it, oh, I'm an algae, I see this coralline structure, I'm invading, and you just got to put up with it.
Right.
And it does happen to bring you a benefit, but
Yeah. So is it an invasion or is it a symbiotic, helpful relationship?
Yeah, it's a. I think most people will consider it a symbiosis or mutualism. So both parties benefit. Whether one party benefits, one partner benefits more than the other, will depend on the species and the conditions that it's growing in, right? So for instance, in Singapore's context, a lot of our corals actually can feed. So if you actually take away the algae, they can still live for some time. So in that sense, they can rely a lot on external nutrients, right? They can feed, they're basically like jellyfish, right? Jellyfish can feed themselves, right? So corals can do that. Some corals, predominantly the bigger polyp ones, that means they have bigger sized jellyfish-like things, and those can feed better. They can feed from even sediment, has nutrients around it. They feed on the sediment, and then that nourishes them. So the degree to which the symbiotes, the algae, contributes to the nutrition of the coral varies depending on the species. Yeah, but most people would still think will consider it still a mutualism that both benefit, primarily because we know corals, if they don't have the algae within them for some time, they can starve, right? And then the algae actually gains other nutrients, right? So the waste that the corals produce becomes the food for the algae, and of course it's like a home for the algae as well. Yeah, but having said that, algae can live without the coral, right? For much better than the other way around. Yeah, so you can find that algae in the seafloor environment, free living. They can swim around. If you sample the water, you will find the symbionts as well. So I would say yes. Usually the partnership is quite there's an imbalance, but that is dependent on the species of coral, also the species of algae as well. Yeah. So it's a very complex, intricate, complex, but yet has dramatic effects on ecosystems, right? So you have bleaching and all that can have a lot of effects on ecosystems.
Yeah, that's true. Are there any other questions on the floor, from the floor? Actually, I have one question. So in terms of like, because they grow, right? And is it like trees? So do you count the age by like the rings, or like by, how do you tell the age of coral? Is it just by size?
Okay. Yeah, so that also is a very complex question, because corals, so I mentioned that they clone, right? So basically like a jellyfish, they split into two, and then two splits into four, and so on. So that's basically a cloning process. We call it asexual reproduction, which means that they just keep splitting. So theoretically, under very good conditions, you can have one jellyfish, right, one coral polyp, splitting into two, and so on forever. There is no end to it, right? So that's essentially what coral restoration, parts of coral restoration is relying on, is this asexual reproduction. So you take a small piece of coral from a living, healthy one, you grow it in an aquarium, like what they're doing at St. John's Island National Marine Lab, and then you grow it up, they clone each other, and then you split that into further pieces, and then you can grow more pieces. And so if there is of course some biological limit to it, but so far it's been shown that you can do that for a long time. So when we look at coral colonies, they have been shown to grow for over hundreds of years, some big colonies that you find. So the age is dependent on how long ago did they start growing from a larvae, right? So from a larvae it becomes this colony. That's the age of the colony. But that colony could actually easily split into two, and then it grows again and all the way to to some kind of biological limit. So that hasn't really been determined. So you can technically, if you give it good conditions, it can grow virtually or practically forever. From one cell, it can grow to to many.
That they're genetically identical?
Yes, so they are clones, and so if they split from each other, then they're genetically identical. A new generation comes along when you have, you heard of coral spawning, right? So every April, they will spawn their eggs and sperm. That is basically the next generation. And so from that, you have eggs and sperm, they meet, they form larvae, they swim around, they attach to the seafloor. That is time zero, right? Or at least the fertilization is time zero, and then you start counting from that time. That will be the age of that colony. Yeah. So from there, of course, you can, if you just give it good conditions, you will grow forever. But most corals will die at some point, because no species have lived forever, right? And we know that from the fossil record as well. Yeah.
So just now you mentioned that in April they always spawn. Is it just locally that we're talking about? Not like globally, right? Because they spawn at different times of the year.
Yeah. Yeah. So in Singapore it's in April, sometimes late. It varies, and it varies with the lunar phases. There is some evidence that they also spawn in August. So there's typically two spawning sort of sub-seasons in a year. That is in Singapore. And it's surprising initially when it was discovered, actually discovered by one of our mentors in the lab. It's surprising because you wouldn't have thought that there would be any seasonality at all in Singapore, where every month, every day is wet and hot, right? But it turns out that the lunar phases have something to do with it, and so it's driving some of these cycles. But this was discovered way back in Australia. The Australian corals also sometimes spawn twice a year, August and sometimes in April as well. But further north in Japan and other areas, it can be a different time. So many reefs also spawn in June. Yeah, so it depends on the region that you're looking at. Yeah, so it's kind of, so if you happen to be diving in Okinawa, for instance, in June, you might see spawning as well.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah. And is this mainly then driven by like an ideal state of like temperature and conditions? And what is that kind of condition that we're looking at when, say we're looking for coral spawning, right?
Yeah. So imagine you are a coral, right? And you can't move. So what do? You send out your eggs and sperm into the water column. So that's called external fertilization. So what kind of conditions do you want the water to be? If let's say your aim is to have a sperm meet an egg, right? So what kind of conditions should it be? Would be best?
Strong
currents. Okay, that's one way to look at it. Why strong current? They move around. Okay, so they move around. But sometimes if you move too far, you might be too far away from your mates, right? So that's there's a benefit to having strong currents, and that will be enhanced connectivity between sites, for instance, between reefs. But corals tend to spawn when it's quite still. So during full moon in April, a few days after the full moon, where the water is quite still, and there's still a water column above the corals for them to mix, then that's when you find that they spawn. And they will usually stay in that area for several hours. That gives them an opportunity to meet, right? So it's kind of like a gathering area like this, where you have people sitting around, not doing much, not moving around, and then you can meet each other, right? If let's say you open up this building, then you're going to be dispersed.
Everywhere.
Yeah, and you can't meet each other. So there's a dilution effect in a sense.
Right, okay.
So that's one So that's one idea. There are many factors that actually can drive spawning. So that's the biological or physical factors that drive it. But in terms of predicting it, so as scientists, when you predict it, it's easier. You just look at the moon phases. So it's like April full moon, a few days after that, they will spawn. So that's quite easy for us to predict, or project spawning.
So it's always around the April full moon season.
Yeah.
And is it very obvious from, like, I don't know, do you have to, if you go underwater for sure, but from the top?
Yeah. Actually, if you are in Singapore, it's a bit harder because the water is quite turbid. But in a clear water environment, like in Great Barrier Reef or anywhere where it's clear, you can see it's like raining, right? It's like inverted raining, where the eggs and sperm are just floating upwards, and you can see the spawn at the top. It's like a slick. It feels like it's an oil slick, but it's actually just coral spawn.
Yeah.
I'm just curious, are there predators? Are there like fishes that really look out for this?
Yes.
Because that's the other factor the corals have to think about, right?
Yeah.
The time when my predators will be coming around, then I start throwing out all this
Yeah.
eaten out. So which species of fish or marine life likes to eat this?
Yeah. So the question is that do
type?
fish like to eat spawn? Yeah.
Yeah.
Fish or prawn, I don't know.
Yeah. So it's a good question. So another condition in which you will want to produce or let go of your eggs and the sperm is in a condition where you are less likely to have your eggs and sperm being eaten. Okay. So one strategy is you sneakily put it out, your eggs and sperm, at different points in time. But this strategy that corals have adopted is that they just mass spawn, right? So the fish, you overwhelm all the predators. You overwhelm all the predators. So the fish do come. It attracts fish, and then the fish attracts bigger predators. So you sometimes have sharks going around during spawning. Yeah. But the goal of this exercise is to overwhelm your predators, and so you release it all at once. So it's called mass spawning. Yeah. So similar species will tend to spawn at similar times. But there's also that there are also it's a balance, right? So if everybody goes off at the same time, then there's a chance that you might meet the wrong person, right? Because like in the midst of all that frenzy, you just mate with somebody that is not your species, then you don't produce an offspring. So they tend to spawn. Species tend to spawn at very specific times, and so that they will distinguish themselves from each other. Otherwise, if everybody goes off at the same time, then you can get a lot of hybridization, which is like combination of different species going together that will not produce a viable offspring, right? So it's a balance. It's a balance between all going out at the same time, which is good for overwhelming predators, but at the same time, you want to be distinguished from each other. Yeah. So it's a good question. Yeah.
Yeah.
Given these two very different modes of reproduction, one essentially cloning, the other, kind of a normal sexual reproduction, what is the genetic diversity in an average reef? How diverse is that, and what factors does that play in the health? We know that populations that are not genetically diverse, something can come through and just wipe them out.
Yeah. So I guess the question is, what is the genetic diversity of a reef? And yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So you're right. So if every colony there just breaks apart and then forms another coral that by what we call asexual reproduction, then you are basically going to have clones. All of everything is going to be the same genetic makeup, and the consequence is that if you have some kind of disease or you have some stress, it will stress all of them in the same way, right? Then they'll disappear. But if there's some variation between them, then of course they will be able to tolerate to some extent. Certain different populations will survive better or worse, and so you have some resilience. So it's a balance. We have done a few studies on genetic diversity of a few species. Typically, what we are finding is that there is some variation, and that variation is there because you are bound to have corals from another reef coming over during a spawning, as I mentioned. Even though it's still, even though there's not much movement, once that time is over, they can still spread to another reef by currents, right? So you have reefs that are connected. So you have incoming new recruits or new babies that form from one reef to another, and that's helping to increase genetic diversity. So that plus recruitment within the same reef, you get a lot of different levels of variation. So the point of it is, if you have spawning, if you have healthy corals spawning every year, then you tend to have some variation. If you don't, they can still grow bigger and so on. You can form multiple colonies, but then they tend to be genetically identical, and that's not good, right? So it has to be both. You need both space, taking over space with that asexual reproduction, but also every year we need to have spawning so that you have new generations of corals forming. But of course, scientists have found that if you have that's also observable in Singapore, is that if you have stress events during that year, they may not spawn during that year, or previous year, if there's a warming event, they might invest less in producing eggs and sperm, right? So it's all cost and benefit for the coral. They have limited resources. They have to use the resources in the right way. If there's a heat stress, then they'll have to try and conserve resources, and so they don't spawn as much the next season. So those are considerations we think about when we look at how healthy a reef is. It's not just about the heat stress themselves causing just death to the coral, but it's also reproduction having an effect as well. Yeah. So that's important. Those are important points.
Yeah. Thanks. And actually, back to the question of hybridization, why? So, I think hybridization is not something new, I guess, but why is it so that it doesn't quite work that way naturally, or
So hybridization is something that is really hard to study, right? So imagine if you want to study whether species they can you can have two populations if they mate with one another. You have to collect the eggs and the sperm, and then you got to do experiments on this. So we don't actually have a good idea of how much hybridization is going on, right? Conventionally in ecological theory, and I'll speak very simply, is that if you allow hybridization to happen, and normally if you have eggs and sperm, they mix, and if they are close enough, they will merge, right? They will merge, and that's not always a good thing because you can produce a hybrid which may not be viable. Okay, but if there are some cases where it can, two different species, they can merge and they produce a third species. So that has apparently happened, and that's been shown for some Caribbean species. So if you go to the Caribbean, you will find that there are a couple of branching species, they call it Acropora, and there are actually three species. The third species is actually formed over the last million years, they believe, because of this hybridization event. Yeah. So you can have hybridization that produces a new species that is viable, but that's kind of quite rare, right? So very, very, very rare to find these kind of instances. Most of the time, if they hybridize, it's like a wasted opportunity, right? In the sense that they may not be viable, and so then they become they die. Basically, the larvae will die, or they produce a coral that is not as healthy eventually. Yeah. So that's the effects of hybridization. Again, not very, very well studied. People are now using genetics to try and piece together this kind of piece together an understanding of how much hybridization happens and so on. Yeah, between species.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So just now I mentioned there are like 250 hard coral species that that was found. But is that all the coral species? Because there's actually more than just hard coral species around Singapore, right?
Right. Yeah. So actually, when the first question I addressed was what is a coral, and I said that they produce the limestone homes. You're right. Actually, not all of them do. So there are soft corals as well. So what we were talking about is a hard coral. There are soft corals, also very diverse in Singapore. I wouldn't be surprised if there are more than 100 or so species in Singapore. That's quite high for this region. And those are essentially the same thing. They are also upside down jellyfish, just that they don't produce limestone. They produce other material which forms like a covering for them, right? So it's protective to some extent, but they also produce more secondary compounds. Those are basically soft corals. Hard corals, there are about 250 species that have been recorded in Singapore, meaning that at various points in time, certain species have been around. But if you go out to the coral reefs today, you probably will find about 150, 160. If you just survey every reef today, you will find about 150 and 60. So there are about 100 species that we haven't really been able to see, to find. We hope that they are in some place where we have not surveyed. So hopefully we can go to more places to study them. But yes, so that's quite typical for many reefs where historically there are this number, but there are usually less when you go out there at any point in time to survey, because again, corals, they can move around in the sense that their larvae can move around, their eggs and sperm move around. They can die from an area, but they will be recruited from another reef at later points in time. So when we say 250, and a lot of people like to use this number, it's just a nice round number, but actually you probably, if you can find 250 corals any point in time, you should let me know, because
By 40.
no, I will want to recruit you to help me find corals. Yeah, we almost never find. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What's the estimated age of the oldest coral reef in Singapore, and where is it?
Coral reef? Oh, okay. So not the
Estimated
coral, right?
age.
The reef itself.
Well, okay, fine. Maybe both.
Okay. So estimated age of the oldest coral or coral reef that you can find in Singapore, and where is it, so that we can go and find it, is it?
Well, it's the oldest coral that I know of, and this is from work from Yani from St. John's Island National Marine Lab, is somewhere in one of the marine parks, Kusu Island. I think it's nearly 100 years, but not as old as 100 years. So probably around 80 years. This was, if I recall correctly. But there are actually, so that is one species that she studied. There are actually other species which I have seen far bigger colonies than those of that species. So there was a colony that I saw also in another marine park, upcoming marine park, where it's 5 meters. So I swam for 5 meters and you just see this coral all the way. It's quite fabulous. That I would hazard that it will be older than 100 years, but I think nobody has studied that. So it's around that ballpark. It's about 100 years. It will be the oldest you will find. The reef itself is a complicated question because reefs, they can grow and then they can stop growing and then they grow again, right? Because it depends on the sea level. So if let's say sea level rises very quickly, then there's not enough light for the corals and they will die. Then the reef stops growing. So there's like we call it a hiatus. Sometimes when the sea level drops, then of course the corals are exposed. Then you will get death as well. So the reef will stop growing. So this can happen over hundreds to thousands of years. But if you ask when did the modern reefs, the reefs we see around us, when did they start growing? The initiation was around 8,000 years. So this was done from basically you have to core into the reef and you take this big machinery and you just put this cylinder, drill it into the reef. You take that whole reef out and then you just basically date what are the corals there. You do radiocarbon dating or other sorts of dating, and you find out, okay, the oldest coral that you find, the deepest coral is around about 7,000 to 8,000 years.
Wow.
So most reefs are around that ballpark, essentially because during that time, all the reefs in the area had they started to form. They have corals that stuck to rocks and then they start growing. So it's around 8,000 years. Then it stopped growing. There's a hiatus, which was a regional event about 4,000 years ago, and then it started growing again in the more recent 1,000 or 2,000 years. So that's kind of well known. But also, someone was asking, they also grow sideways. So this is what happens to the reef flat. Yeah. So that's the story of the reef flat. But the reef crest and all that would be a bit different. Yeah. So 8,000 is the oldest.
Wow.
Singapore reefs well explored, or there's some part of reefs that have been undersampled or something?
Yeah, so the question is whether reefs in Singapore have been well explored. Thanks to volunteers, really not just the scientists, but volunteers, citizen scientists, we have actually mapped quite well where the reefs are, right? So we have a good map of where the reefs are, both in terms of observation. So people go into the water and see, okay, there's a reef there, try and measure how much coral is growing there, but also with satellite imagery, you can see some of the intertidal reefs especially. So all that combined gives us a good understanding of where the reefs are, what kind of reefs there are. But if you're asking about what's the type of studies that are done on them, then really it's quite uneven, right? Most of our understanding of Singapore's reefs come from 2 to 3 islands. Do you all want to know which 3 islands form our main understanding of what Singapore reefs are? Not really St. John's. Yeah. St. John's is a good guess, but it's not St. John's.
Kusu.
Also not Kusu. In fact, Kusu is one of the more recent finds actually, interestingly. Yeah. But it's actually a popular reef that some of you go to.
Changi
No,
Beach.
not Changi.
Semakau. Sisters.
Hantu. Someone say Hantu. Right? A lot of you go out there every weekend. Hantu is one of the most, probably the most studied reef in Singapore. Yeah, specifically the west side of Hantu. Yeah, so a lot of groups, a lot of studies, academic and citizen science go there. Another one is Raffles Lighthouse. Yeah, so Raffles Lighthouse. It's really because scientists like to contrast a good reef in a sense that it's clearer waters. That's the southernmost reef in Singapore. That's Raffles Lighthouse. Contrast that with a more urban reef, closer to development. In fact, it's really just 200-300 meters away from Bukom, right? So that's kind of an urban representative. But Kusu is a close one as well, because Kusu is the only reef that is well studied that is facing the prevailing currents. So that's sort of the another representative. So these 3 reefs, yeah, form the main bulk of the studies in Singapore.
So when you study these reefs that are closer to development and then those that are further away, so is there clear, like marked difference between the development of the corals and how far they've grown and all that?
Yeah, definitely there are differences. So the differences can come down to diversity. That means how many species are there. They can come down to not just the diversity of corals, but they can be different for different groups. So like people studying fish, the diversity can have a different gradient in a sense. Differences are very different from what you find for corals, but also the natural environment also drives this variation. So for instance, we know that Raffles Lighthouse, the southernmost reef, is quite clear, right? So if you go there diving, you can at least see your buddy. And that is a consequence of there's natural variation as well. So most of the reefs, they are close to the mainland. Even if you go back before development, before coastal reclamation, they are also quite murky. So our area is known to be we call it turbid reef environment even before development, right? So sometimes it's very hard to tease apart the kind of turbid because of urbanization versus turbid because of natural causes. And because we are basically sitting in a very shallow environment, you have 2 big rivers from Johor draining down, right? Natural sediment comes down to our reef. So a lot of it is not known what's the contribution of sort of urban versus natural causes of these sediment. Yeah, but yes, you can see clear differences.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Just a curious question. Between the hard coral and the soft coral, are there any differences in terms of their resilience, or they both require the same kind of environment to strive and survive?
So the resilience of a hard and a soft coral is the
Is one more
question.
resilient because it's harder, or not?
Yeah, they grow in different conditions. So, for instance, soft corals, they thrive in environments where there's a lot more. It's more dynamic, because imagine if you are a soft coral in a reef environment. There's always corals around you. There's always hard corals around you. So you don't always do very well. So they tend to flourish in environments which change a lot. So you have these both anemones and also soft corals. They can grow faster because they don't have to build that house, right? They just build themselves with some material around them, right? So they can grow faster. They can take over spaces faster. So they tend to flourish in more dynamic, changing environments much faster than corals, where they have to, of course they are fast-growing corals, but generally that's what we think is the difference between them. They can also vary in their nutrient requirements. Certain species of soft corals can grow very fast because they have nutrients around them. They feed much faster compared to corals. They may not rely a lot on their algal symbionts. So these are general trends that you see, differences between them. Yeah.
So would you say that the soft corals are more, would be subjected to, I guess, the warming climate, the changing in waters, more so than the harder corals because of the makeup of how they're made? They just...
No, I think the different groups, they are all subjected to the stresses of, first is thermal, that means high temperatures can cause the symbiosis to break down, right? So the coral with the algal symbiont can break down. Soft coral also have that symbiosis, so they are also, they also can have the same stresses. I think it's just how fast they grow and how fast they capitalize on the nutrients around them that will make them different. They all will have similar effects under. So the idea is when you have very warm, with a warming climate, what's going to happen is only very specific species will survive, whether it's soft or hard. You know, so what happens is you have a decline in diversity, so fewer species that can tolerate those warmer environments will survive, whether it's hard or soft.
Yeah. Maybe you could kind of explain, I think in terms of coral bleaching, we do know that corals have an ability to bounce back, even though they've been bleached like a little bit. But where's like the turning point, and what is maybe the breaking point whereby, you know, I think in terms of like how long they've been bleached and all that.
So you might have heard in the news that we are in the 4th global coral bleaching event. This means that on majority of reefs, in most of the corals have their algal symbionts, you know, removed from the coral. So you have this whitening of the coral. So what this happens is that it essentially boils down to nutrition, right? Whether the corals can gain enough nutrients to survive, right? So if the corals can feed themselves, then they will persist. If they don't, then they will die. So, and this persistence varies between different species, but essentially there are some species that are very sensitive. Once you remove the algae, the symbiont from them, within 2-3 weeks they are dead. Sometimes even within days they are dead. Yeah. So these are species which they cannot feed very well, right? So they rely a lot on the symbionts. I mentioned before that how much nutrition you gain from the symbiont is actually different between different species. So those species will suffer the most, and we don't actually have a lot of those species in Singapore, interestingly, for a variety of reasons. But yeah, those are typically if you go to very nice reef, these branching, brightly colored species, those are the ones that don't do very well under bleaching conditions. There are species where they can survive for a month, even 2 months, without just being white, right? And then you think they're stressed. They're stressed, but they can, if the conditions return to normal, the temperature goes down, then they can recruit back the symbionts, and then within weeks they can be back to normal. Yeah. So different species have different tolerances. So essentially, bleaching is a story about whether they bleach, how fast they bleach, but also how well they recover, right? So there's the being what we call susceptibility, and also recoverability, whether they can recover from it. Yeah. So it's a balance. It's sort of it's kind of like if you don't bleach, but then if you bleach you don't recover, then you're also screwed, right? If you bleach and you don't recover, also not so good. Yeah. Or if you bleach a lot, even though you can recover, also not very good. Yeah. So these different strategies or different outcomes can drive dynamics on the reef during bleaching. Yeah.
Are corals like adaptable, which means because they're sort of like animals, right? So like animals generally they adapt quite well. They've learned that, oh, this is the climate conditions, or this is the change in environment, so I adapt a little bit more this year. Do they do that?
Yeah. Okay. So in my biology class, we always try to make a distinction between what is adaptation and what is acclimatization. Okay. So I explain what the difference is. Adaptation is, let's say you have a coral, right? Or let's say you are in a family which lives in Singapore, right? And you just live in Singapore. You have a family here. You live here for a long time. So you're very used to it, right, here. And then suddenly I bring you to another area, that you're not adapted to the new area, right? So adaptation is over generations, right? Meaning that the corals that we think about that are adapted to that environment has done so over many generations. So that's adaptation. Acclimatization, on the other hand, is what you were talking about, where corals can bleach, right? And then they can recover, and then if they can actually get used to it, right? They can get used to bad environments, or they can do something or take in something, some kind of medicine, which will allow them to tolerate bad conditions better, right? So one of these ways is that these corals, when they bleach, they will take in a different symbiont, because symbiont is just not just one species, there are multiple species of that symbiont. If their symbiont actually is quite tolerant to heat, then actually it confers some resilience to the coral as well. So that's why it's a two-party, both partners have a role in resilience of the coral, right? So that is acclimatization. So you can actually recruit symbionts that are tougher, or you can somehow, like kids, right? If you put them in a nice environment, they become very noir, and then they don't want to do things, right? But if you stress them, not to say that you should stress your kids, but let's say you just give them periodic stress, very minor little stress, give them a bit of a little bit of challenge, right? Then they become stronger, right? And the same goes for corals, actually. So if corals, certain species, are not all of them, if you subject them to what we call sublethal stress, that means you don't kill the coral, but you give them a bit of stress, the next time a bleaching comes along, they are actually prepared for it, right? So in a sense, what doesn't kill you make you stronger is actually true for the coral. So there are these different types of acclimatization strategies, right? Either you do it because of stress on its own, or you take in a symbiont that actually allows you to tolerate stress much better. So that's acclimatization.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay, very interesting. Never knew, but wow, thanks. Any questions from the floor? I do have a question that was submitted. It's on the Long Island project that's coming up, and it's obviously due to land. There will be more land reclamation. The person would like to know, how does that affect our offshore ecology? Because they're clearly going to like bank it up, right? Yeah.
Okay, so it's a multi-dimensional question, right? So because we are looking at clearly that there's something needs to be done for sea level rise, right? Now East Coast actually is an interesting area because East Coast was reclaimed in the 70s, 60s and 70s. So in a sense, the entire East Coast area is an artificial habitat, right? The beaches are artificial, the seawalls are artificial. Having said that, over the last decade, lots of corals have recruited there. So some of you can see it, right? You go to the seawall, you look down, you'll see corals growing, and it's very diverse. I mean, relatively diverse. Not the same as a natural habitat, right? So it is not a reef. So when we look at areas like East Coast, originally it's actually a sandy beach, right? Sandy, muddy, sometimes with seagrass. And then when you reclaim it, they put seawalls around it. That actually gave an opportunity for corals to grow. There's nothing good or bad about that. They just grow there. Right now, half a century later, we now want to reclaim that. Now, so we got to look at a few things. One is, are we looking at a natural environment? To some extent, it's natural because it's natural recruitment, right? But it is not originally it's not a reef, and it's also still not a reef. So we have to look at the baseline. What do we want to save? Where do we want to bring the environment back to? What is the baseline we are looking at? Okay. But having said that, once you have determined what is that conservation aim, then you move offshore and you look at, okay, where is the island going to be? The island is indeed going to be on, at least what's planned is going to be a reclamation on sandy muddy bottom. Now that's probably mostly natural. That means there's not been any reclamation in the area, so it's natural. So you're going to lose new species or lose species that are living in that kind of environment. So we definitely will see some impact, right, on that in the environment. Whether those impacts spill over to coral reefs in the region, in southern islands and so on, will depend on the specifications of the reclamation and also specifications of the mitigation that they're going to put in. So for instance, if they put in effort to put silk screens and vary or phase the reclamation in a way that will minimize sedimentation, then I think the impact can be mitigated, right? Or you can have less impact. I don't think there will ever be a chance where it will be no impact. No environmental consultant will say that there will be no impact with such a large scale reclamation. But I think the question is how big is the impact and how do we mitigate it? Yeah. So in terms of reef, I think because the actual specification of the reclamation is not known yet, so it's very hard to predict what's going to happen to the reef, and how long this reclamation will happen over. So it's really hard to predict at this point. I think what is important is we ask questions about what this project is about. We ask how long it's going to be. We ask about mitigation. We ask about monitoring. I think these are questions we all have a responsibility to ask, because it is not just the environment, it's also people living around there, who people going to recreational areas there. Those are key stakeholders of that environment. So I think we have a responsibility to ask these kind of questions. Yeah.
Thanks.
Moving forward.
I think you brought up a really good point about like what can we do, because for us in Singapore, I think we really enjoy the corals as recreational, I would say like an artifact or so. And asking these questions are important, because then these stakeholders who are in charge of the project have a responsibility to give you an answer. And by doing so, they'll have to do more research, or they'll look into it a little bit more carefully. And I think that really matters. But also, I think maybe you could share, because in Singapore, we don't depend on these corals for anything, but I'm sure there are other countries that do. Can you share some of these like ecosystem services that these coral reefs provide for these other nations that might depend on it?
Yeah. So I learned diving in Malaysia. Like many of you, I went to where did I go? I went to Dayang, I think, right? So I was there when I was in my early 20s, right? So I went there, and then I saw, wow, these coral reefs in Malaysia, colorful, diverse. And I came back, and then I started working on a project in Singapore. And I thought, hey, these same reefs or similar reefs are here. Why do I go all the way to Malaysia, right? Then I started to ask, would these areas actually be good areas for recreation, for dive tourism, for instance? I think that's one, right? So obviously, there are people who have gone to our reefs repeatedly, and of course, it's a good area to learn diving. Whether dive tourism is something that is going to be big, we don't know. It depends on how we want to build it. But definitely, it has social cultural roles, right, for Singapore, right? A lot of people go to the reefs and they gain a lot out of just being on the reef, being a natural area. So knowing also that these reefs go back to thousands of years, give you that kind of very, it's a special place, right, in Singapore. Of course, we don't harvest fisheries from our coral reefs here. So there is no direct gain or economic gain from the biology of the reef. But you have to realize that Singapore's reef sits between many important fisheries, right? So Malacca Straits, lots of fisheries, important fisheries. South China Sea, Philippines, all the way to Philippines, there's lots of fisheries. We sit sort of in the middle. We are in a through flow, not part of the Indonesian through flow, if you know that. That means it's where currents actually flow from South China Sea through the Indonesian waters. Some of that goes up to Malacca Strait. So some of that waters goes through our reefs. And during that time, you get recruitment, right, of fish. It's some kind of a, stepping stone before larvae travel to the other side, to the Indian Ocean and so on. So I think any reef that you have that is a stepping stone can be critical. Of course, if we look at it nationally, then we don't know, because the reefs are found in the fish that you harvest is from Philippines and so on. But food fish is one that depends on this connectivity. So ecosystem services derived from this connectivity is really important. Of course, we can always think about the physical structure of the reef. It will protect from strong waves, right? Especially now with sea level rise, this is going to be more important. If we have a reef in front of us, that is basically a natural seawall, right? That will build itself. You don't have to go and build a seawall. The seawall is there. It's a natural. If you have a healthy natural reef, you'll grow upwards. together with sea level, so it's now growing well, it will grow along with sea level, it will block us from the most extreme waves and storms. So I think that's one important ecosystem service that we need to consider. Others could be, research is one big one. I would say that the reefs in Singapore are probably one of the most well-researched reefs definitely in the region. Probably by area alone, much more well-researched than even the Great Barrier Reef, because we have been looking at these reefs since the 70s, since the 60s. In fact, we just got this large set of donations from a professor who was studying reefs, coral reefs in the 1960s. So he's sort of very old, he's retired, but he wants to donate his material to us, and that all that resource, that research is really important, telling us it's actually a good example of how reefs can become if you develop, if you have a hyper development of an area, right? So many countries in the Southeast Asian region is going in this direction, hyper development, hyper urbanization. So we are a good example of what reefs can become, but also how reefs can become eventually, right? How we mitigate those losses and impacts. So I think in terms of research is very important. There's a cultural, social cultural important. Of course, climate change, mitigation against sea level rise and so on. Those are all very important services.
Yeah, thanks. I think there is a question about nature-based solutions for climate adaptation, but actually this also links to my own question about coral restoration, because you can put in, like, I would say artificial reefs or even maybe natural restoration. Yeah. So what are your thoughts about that, and how do you do, like, firstly, how do you conduct a coral restoration? And if they clone themselves and quite quickly, then why do we need all these like 3D reefs and all that? You know?
Okay, so coral restoration, there are many different forms, right? And I'm not the expert in the people behind who are experts in coral restoration, but I think I will classify them into two. One is, I think, consider them passive restoration, where you basically put in structures or conditions that will encourage growth, recruitment, and also growth of corals. So that would, for instance, be putting structures that would be stable. One of the issues with Singapore's reef is that because of the sediment, which has become incorporated into the reef matrix, the reef structure is quite unstable. Not that you should do it, but if you go onto any reef here, it's kind of like, it's a bit shaky. There are some corals that are a bit, it's not fixed because there's a lot of sediment. I think that's one of the reasons. So in order to stabilize, if you stabilize the substrate, you can allow corals to grow better, right? That's sort of passively doing it. Active restoration will be if you are planting the corals, if you are doing transplantation. If you are growing the corals in the nursery and putting it out, and that's transplantation, that's more active. Both have their roles in different sites. I think it's important to have an understanding of what are the goals of your restoration project. So if your restoration project is to increase the amount of corals that are growing within a fairly short amount of time, then you need to put in more effort to plant the corals, right? Because if you just do passive restoration, it will take, you have to take spawning events for the larvae to swim to your structures, attach to your structures, and grow over years to become an adult. But if you want to speed up the process and you have the resources, then if you plant those nursery grown corals, then they can speed up the process. But there are limitations to that as well. We will never be able to restore the entire reef in its natural state if you plant it, because you are basically actively, you're deciding what corals go here, what corals go there. But in actual fact, we don't actually know what are the interactions between those coral species. So we lose a bit of the natural state of the reef when we do that, right? So there are benefits and costs to different strategies. So those are the types of coral restoration. Is a broad framework of how you can think about coral restoration. And so what was the other question about?
It was about nature-based solutions being climate adaptations for, so what are your views on the nature-based solutions as climate adaptation measures?
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, nature-based solutions is a very, very broad term, but it's also quite narrow in some of the academic discussion, right? So when I first heard about nature-based solution, it was in the context of protecting ecosystems that will basically just is nature-based, right? So you just be natural, right? So you just protect an area, let it be natural, let it do its thing. So that's basically what nature-based solution is in certain contexts, and that has been true for initially for some of these habitats. For instance, mangroves and seagrasses, they sequester a lot of carbon, right, in the sediment, in the biomass that they accumulate. So if you protect those ecosystems, you keep it natural, then it is a nature-based solution, because the solution is if you keep the carbon in the ground, then the carbon is not going to be in the atmosphere. It's not going to be warming the atmosphere, right? So there's one nature-based solution. It has of course evolved, and now we think about nature-based solution in almost every context, right? So even having a coral nursery is kind of a nature-based solution. So I think I try not to use that term very broadly now. I think it's important we decide, okay, are we going to, is it climate mitigation we are interested in? If it's climate mitigation, then the goal is to keep carbon in the ground, right? Then that's about conserving mangroves, conserving seagrass ecosystems in the ground. But if your goal is nature-based restoration of a site, so for instance, if you want to restore a coral reef, a nature-based solution would be, for instance, a passive kind of restoration where you enable corals to grow naturally, to recruit and grow naturally. That's considered a nature-based solution as well. Yeah. So it can be different types of solution in different contexts and different scales as well. Yeah. But overall, I think we should endeavor to have some some parts of nature in our restoration projects. So nature-based solutions in that we incorporate parts of nature in our design of even if it's an artificial structure that we have to put in, then we try and mimic what nature would be like. I think that would be important. Yeah, moving forward.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm a bit mindful of time, so I'll close with one last question, and usually we like a call to action as well. I think what is like the key takeaway that you would kind of encourage people to do towards like just coral reef, it could be restoration or the conservation of it, like maybe in and around Singapore?
Yeah, I think in a way my journey and many of us here is really started with understanding the ecosystem, right? So and I would say the reason why I'm so interested in trying to restore ecosystems or learn about the ecosystems is because of the initial understanding I have, and I think knowledge is quite powerful. Having that understanding of that there are in fact reefs here is already a very important driver for many of us, right? And so I believe that, and a lot of people in Singapore don't know we have reefs now, right? So I think just overcoming that hurdle is important. And so I think bringing as many, you bring the knowledge to people, or whether or not you bring them to the reef, either one works. And so basically education is a very big part of this story. And of course there are now lots of projects from MParks to research labs to lots of organizations, NGOs that are very active in reef restoration. Volunteer your time, if you have time, in various aspects. Could be education, could be field restoration, could be doing research. I think those are, whatever you think you have the most impact in, then that's where I think it will be meaningful for you, because you will spread that knowledge better, right, when you are involved in it and you really are so invested in it. So I think it's really important to contribute where you really like to contribute, and that I think has the biggest impact, right? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. So with that, I think we'll end this segment of the talk. And of course, I think he can't go out. So if you want to, ambush him on the way out, you can. But just before we go, I actually do have a little film to share with you guys. It's just 10 minutes, and it is on coral restoration. So please sit back. Actually, I let me check if the Bluetooth speaker is on. Let me just confirm that. Sorry. Yeah, it's not connected. Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. Oh, tell them that. Oh, those online, the link is in the chat group. We won't. Okay, so this film is called Coral Comeback. It's based in Hawaii. So here you go. So thank you to Wild Hope. Okay. Okay. Do you have a speaker? Oh. No. Okay. Sorry. What is going on? Sorry. Yeah. I think now it's more like the network is, you know. Sorry. I do have full connection. Oh. Oh. There we go.
Underwater surfaces. Many create stony skeletons around their bodies, which accumulate over time to form colonies that make help protect biodiversity near you. Visit wildhope.tv and come back on Mondays for more Wild Hope right here at PBS Nature on YouTube.
So thank you so much for joining us and watching that. I would actually just like to quickly share with you guys what you just saw. So we are running something called Earth in Focus Singapore Nature Film Festival at the end of this year. So there'll be a lot more of such films to come along, and hopefully a lot more of what is done locally and around the region. So that's just one part of a film that was filmed by, of course, our partners at Wild Hope and at PBS. And we definitely hope to bring more of these kind of like nature-based films to you guys. So do come for the festival. It's from the 1st to the 3rd of November in Sentosa. We will be hosting various satellite events leading up to this main festival. And of course, at the main festival, there will be film screenings, panel discussions, and all of that. And of course, nature and photography exhibitions and masterclasses if you're interested to learn how to do filming underwater or like even on land, etc. We will also have a film and photography competition, and prizes are really, really good. You will be, of course, we do have short films and a mobile film category competition and a nature photography competition as well. So stay tuned to our social media at earthinfocus.co on Instagram. We are, of course, supported by all these wonderful, wonderful partners and sponsors. Yeah, so do stay tuned to what's coming up next. And in addition to that, I think just to close off, of course, I'd like to thank Professor Danwei for coming to share with us his expertise and knowledge about corals. I think I've learned a lot myself, and thank you everyone for coming and sitting on the floor as well. Must be really uncomfortable, butt pain. But next up, we will be actually having, we will be chatting with Elliot Ong and in Tun Shen. So Elliot is a project partnerships manager from Nature Co. And Tun is from previously from Climate Impact X. They both work as carbon specialists. So one of them develops projects for carbon credits, and the other one works in the marketplace to kind of trade carbon credits. So yeah, do join us the next round to find out more about carbon credits. And don't forget to, of course, follow us on social media. We're on multiple social media platforms. We are at _WildSpace. Earth in Focus is at earthinfocus.co. Strangers Convo is at Strangers Convos. And yeah, and before you head out, please do sign our guest book. We have a guest book on the table. It's a starfish. So you just sign your name, write a note for us. We hope to put it into an exhibition. It's an exhibition of our native wildlife that people who have attended our events would have contributed to it. So yeah, please do that on your way out. And thank you so much for attending, and stay wacky, wild, and curious. Till the next time. Yep, see you guys. Thanks. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing. I learned